So here we go, the top 20 games of the decade, or at least the initial 10 of them. These games need to meet some criteria. 1, I have to have beaten the main campaign of the game to completion if it's a single-player game. Late PC ports count. And finally, criteria number 3, it has to be a game I enjoyed playing. Duh, right? But again, if you saw my honorable mentions, you're not gonna see games like Spec Ops: The Line on here because that game is great, but not really enjoyable, not really fun. You'd have to be some kind of fucked up masochist to have fun in that game. So let's dive right into it. Coming in at number 20, we have Bastion. Don't worry, the entire list won't be composed of artsy indie stuff, although you really shouldn't judge games like that because you might miss something really amazing. Case in point, Bastion. The gameplay at its core is fun enough, plays like a twin-stick shooter, but where the game really hits you is in its visually enthralling art style and some of the best music I've ever heard in a game. Of course, you also can't forget the narrator, one of the best parts of the game. The narration is done by a man named Logan Cunningham, whose voice I can only describe as audible Scotch whiskey. He narrates just about everything you do in this very thematic way. It was one of the more unique games I played at the time when I was first trying out these smaller, independently made video games, and almost 9 years later, it still holds up extremely well, with other games trying to copy some of its tropes. If there was one complaint I had, the gameplay doesn't have a lot of depth, but it is still fun to pick up and play, and play it again even on New Game Plus after some time has passed. Still absolutely worth one playthrough though, it's a really amazing game. Coming in at number 19, Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Like most of you, I used to like the Assassin's Creed franchise when it was new, but dropped it around the time Revelations came out due to franchise fatigue. Even a brand new setting and engine couldn't reinvigorate my interest when Assassin's Creed 3 came out, partly due to an uninteresting, kind of bland protagonist. So imagine my shock that I ended up putting Black Flag, an Assassin's Creed game, on this list. Sure, there's still trailing missions, brainless melee combat, viewpoints, and a dumpster fire of collectibles. But the ship-to-ship combat is so much fun, even if it is a little bit simplistic. Sailing on the high seas, listening to your crew sing sea shanties while you plunder and pillage ships and forts is awesome. It's an amazing experience. The idea of building up your pirate ship, sinking bigger and bigger targets is interesting to me. I found myself doing more of the side ship content than the main Assassin's Creed stuff. And I just found myself sitting on my couch and relaxing, just really taking in the amazing sound design and all the sea shanties that are constantly sung to me. I played enough of this game where I can just spend hours traveling the sea and doing the optional stuff. Now, unlike a lot of the other Assassin's Creed games, this game still manages to hold some of my interest when it comes to the core Assassin's Creed gameplay experience. You have a relatable and likable protagonist, solid writing for the dialogue, fantastic voice work, a great original score, as well as some tweaks to the core Assassin's Creed formula to make the combat a bit less repetitive. But it's Edward Kenway's story that really kept me playing the main content, even though it kinda falls down a hill a little bit near the end. The game has a story worth playing through, but once again, being Assassin's Creed, it has to have a weird-ass meta-story that breaks up the action with something boring that you don't give a shit about. That and the always dull melee combat. It's a little bit better here because you can dual wield and you can do some other stuff that you couldn't do in 3, but it's still a little repetitive. Still, one of the better open world games I've played this decade, one of the better Assassin's Creed games, probably in my top 3. Just play it past the first 2 hours. The first 2 hours are a little boring, but after that, it gets very, very fun. At number 18, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 1 and 2. I know I'm probably going to get a ton of flack for putting Call of Duty games on a list like this, but I had a shitload of fun with both these games. I could go either way with each one being at this spot in my list. They've both got unique settings, fun gameplay, and with Black Ops 2 in particular, branching story paths. I even like the RTS segments from the game. Reminded me of Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter 2, and if you've seen my video on it, you know I fucking love that game. It experimented with the futuristic levels before the other games tried it, and they still remain the best in the franchise, in my opinion. When it comes to the best Call of Duty game, COD 4 Modern Warfare is pretty tough to beat, but when it comes to the sheer fun in the moment-to-moment of each game, Black Ops 1 and 2 are some of my absolute favorite Call of Duty games. It helps that everything about them just oozes cool. All those different locations with connections between the two games, as well as a really solid cast of characters. It's hard to believe, but this was that era of Call of Duty where you could drop $60 on a Call of Duty game and get your money's worth just from the campaign. But Treyarch didn't stop there. You also had zombies as well as the multiplayer mode to add tons of value to an already great game. After Modern Warfare 3, I was gun-shy about buying another Call of Duty title, and Black Ops 2 ended up being a saving grace for me, at least temporarily. Unfortunately, Call of Duty Ghosts was released shortly after, which permanently soured my interest in the franchise. I haven't pre-ordered a COD game since. But with Black Ops 2, we had one final great campaign to tie off the 7th generation of consoles. Call of Duty's Golden Era. A fantastic farewell. Coming in at number 17, we have Dead Space 2. I've never been one for horror games, but franchises like Fear and Dead Space, at least for the first two games, are some of the best experiences I've ever had. Primarily because they are more thrillers with elements of horror. In a typical horror game, I can only outrun the scary monster. In Dead Space 2, I can shoot the fucker and have a grand old time doing it, but there's that added tension of fighting hordes of terrifying enemies, but they also move around in the shadows and in vents, utilizing amazing sound design to keep your finger twitching around the trigger, death gripping your controller. While not very scary, Dead Space 1's a little bit more scary. 2 is more like an action game. It's the long stretches of gameplay that cycle between pure tension and adrenaline. Dead Space 2, absolutely fantastic to play. Some would say that despite it being a more action-focused sequel, it's a better game than 1, but after finally finishing both games just recently, I still think Dead Space 1 can be more tense, and I like the ending better, but Dead Space 2 is a worthy sequel, and it deserves a spot on my list. It's too bad the developers are gone, and we may never see a follow-up, a true follow-up, to Dead Space 2. At number 16, we have Mass Effect 2, another great franchise EA destroyed. One of the first games I owned on Steam back when I was transitioning to PC gaming. I remember hearing about this game in high school, and upon playing it, I absolutely adored it, putting well over 100 hours into it. While some may say the RPG elements were stripped out from the first game in favor of something more watered down for COD fanboys like myself at the time, I personally thought the game was exceptional. As someone who just started playing Mass Effect 1, it is the most janky piece of shit shooter I've ever played. I like it, I will finish it, and finally get around to all the DLC I missed out on in the trilogy, but holy fuck, Mass Effect 1 needs a remaster, badly. Mass Effect 2, on the other hand, is such a huge improvement over the first, cutting out so much fat and giving the game a better sense of pacing and direction. The writing is pretty great, the gunplay is fun, and the story and universe is easy to follow and still engaging to a newcomer. So much love and care was put into this franchise, but 2 is one of the best simply because of how well put together it is from beginning to end. Especially with the ending. It's one of the better final missions, one of the best final missions in any game, period. It's just a shame that, like Dead Space, Mass Effect won't be seeing another game in the franchise anytime soon, and if it is, it's probably not gonna be a good one. Halo Reach. It's sad to think that this black sheep of the franchise is now considered the best Halo game of the decade by default because 343 Industries can't make a good Halo game, to save their life. Say what you want about all the mistakes Bungie made with this game, but a ton of love and care was put into it, even if it didn't come out the way we wanted it to. It was also further screwed with through 343 Industries, a studio run by barn animals. They got their hands on the post-release content of the game and started making even shittier changes to the core multiplayer component. And the latest iteration by Splash Damage and 343 Industries has completely ruined the multiplayer component almost beyond repair by not only retaining these terrible changes made to the post-launch 360 version, but also releasing an unfinished product that caused the player base on PC to completely plummet by over 90% in a matter of 2 months. However, when I put Halo Reach at this spot in the list, it's for the Bungie-made 360 release. Reach may have been raped and buried in a ditch by 343 Industries, Microsoft and Splash Damage, but the original version by Bungie is still an amazing game and well worthy of being called Halo. The new modes and customization kept me hooked for hours playing. I probably clocked dozens of hours playing Headhunter on sword base alone, and upon playing it again on the flawed Chief Collection, I can still find it just as fun as I did 10 years ago. The Forge mode added near limitless customization to map design, and of course you have the much improved Firefight mode, the co-op Horde mode from ODST, that also is customizable in and of itself, that added even more content to an already staggering release. While the single player in retrospect wasn't a great Halo campaign and wasn't very good story-wise, I mean your teammates just feel like cardboard cutouts through bare-bones writing and plot devices, it was still fun as a sci-fi FPS with some great trademark Halo moments. The soundtrack is one of the best in the series, with Marty O'Donnell staying on one last time for a kick-ass original score to match the excellent graphics and presentation that pushed the 360 to its limits. One of my all-time favorite shooters. Had the PC version been what it should have been, this might have been in my top 10. Number 13, we come to Dark Souls 2. The best and worst thing about Dark Souls 2 is that it's just another Dark Souls game, but it's still a ton of fun. A lot of the complaints online stick out like sore thumbs when you start playing the game, unfortunately. Like how most of the enemies are just dudes in armor, the level complexity was cut down, and the difficulty is way easier and more lax. Scholar of the First Sin tried to fix the difficulty issue, but failed in my eyes, feeling more like a fan mod that splits the game's multiplayer community and cheapens the difficulty curve in a poor attempt to make the game more challenging. In fact, I found it so baffling that when people referred to Dark Souls 2 as being terrible, I thought they were referring to Scholar and not the vanilla game, because the vanilla game is actually really fun when you get down to it, even if it is a little easy. It's just uninspired. It's still fun to swing a big sword and wreck demons and knights. While the enemy design isn't interesting like the first game, the dudes in armor are still fun to fight. I always found that a guy about your size or a little taller was always more fun to fight than a big demon monster, because those guys have movesets where you're just kind of running under them or rolling under them and stabbing them in the heels until they die. So while you may roll your eyes at dude in armor fight number 20, it's still genuinely fun and challenging while not being frustrating, for the most part. While Dark Souls 3 should technically deserve this spot because it actually invokes a lot more challenge and skill and has much better creative design in general, it's kind of nice just to have that sweet power fantasy of murdering everything. Plus, and more importantly, Dark Souls 3 just feels like a massive rehash of 1, whereas 2 did make an effort in some regard to try some new stuff that didn't work out, but still managed to be consistently fun. Dark Souls 3 has plenty of low and forgettable points whenever it tried to be new. The highlight of that game is going back to places that are connected to where you've been in Dark Souls 1, so they feel like reskins or HD upgrades. But Dark Souls 2 has places like Majula, Dragonary, and Drangleic Castle, and they don't come off as Dark Souls 1 ripoff locations, they stand on their own. At the end of the day, Dark Souls 2 is a forgettable title with some exceptions, but it's still fun as hell. All I want is a fun game where I can swing a big-ass sword around and slay monsters and men in a dark fantasy setting. So I basically want a Berserk game. A good Berserk game. Riding into town at number 13, we have Metro Exodus. It might be a bit too early, as this game is still fresh in my mind from 2019, but damn, it was a good-ass game. A great ending for the franchise in what has been a history of hit-or-miss decision-making in terms of primarily gameplay. The first game has an absolutely incredible sense of atmosphere that few games could really compete with. Gunplay wasn't its strength, though. Last Light, the sequel, tried improving upon the formula by optimizing the stealth system and the gunplay, but the voice acting took a hit for the worst, certain gameplay segments weren't fun at all, especially parts on the surface, and the gunplay still felt lacking compared to other shooters, arguably making it a worse game than its predecessor. The Redux of 2033 and Last Light improved a few things, but the remake of 2033 lost some soul, including the changed voice acting to fit continuity with Last Light. Metro Exodus fixes all the mistakes made by Last Light while nearly capturing the heart of the original. The game has a semi-open world with linear areas within that world, and there's even these more limited linear levels that invoke the feeling of Metro 2033. Each open world area you travel to with your Scooby-Doo band of soldiers each has their own palette of terrain, color, and weather, giving you not only the frozen wastelands of Metro 2033, but also the more colorful and swampy areas of Last Light, in addition to an original and not so original new to the series area, the Mad Max Desert area is what I'm gonna call it, which in all honesty is actually pretty fucking fantastic, with one of the best levels in the game. I won't spoil it, but it's fucking terrifying, and the sound design really amplifies it. I almost jumped up 10 feet in the air from my chair when someone tapped me on the shoulder while I was playing through it. 10 out of 10 would almost destroy my headset again. The gunplay is the best it's ever been, with the collectible aspect of finding new gun mods and just ending up being a totally compelling way of just traveling through the map. The survival element of scavenging ammo, filters, and medpacks is back and done very well here. The stealth aspect is improved significantly, and while the voice acting is a bit dodgy at times for the English version, especially for some of the side characters, it does manage to be a significant improvement over Last Light, and it has some great moments through a few great performances. 10 out of 10, would fuck my hot Eastern European waifu again. Alright, now for game number 12. Watch as I destroy every sense of credibility that I haven't yet already lost. Senran Kagura, Deep Crimson. Listen, this game is amazing. It's one of the best character-driven games I've played in ages that isn't some 80-hour-long JRPG with shitloads of repetitive grinding and meaningless tasks. What if I want a story with some simplistic, yet also hype-as-fuck gameplay, accompanied with a bangin' soundtrack, fantastic voice acting, and some quality fan service all thrown in on a portable console? Take your waifus with you, wherever you go, not just in your pocket, but in your heart. In all seriousness though, the Senran Kagura games have always been a mixed bag when it comes to pacing and gameplay. The stories take a while to develop on the better games like Burst, and when they finally get going, they still have a lot of problems when it comes to things like control, variety, pacing, or even skimping on presentation for story segments. It's hard to believe that Deep Crimson, the sequel to the first game on 3DS, hardly suffers from these problems as much as the later games do. To that end, Deep Crimson has an amazing story and narrative structure that integrates greatly into its gameplay through its new tag team mode, allowing for co-op play. The soundtrack range of tone and instrumental variety is the best yet, with amazing Dynasty Warriors style bangin' metal and rock, to warmer, catchy little jingles, all the way to harrowing darkness that creates emptiness in your soul. One of my favorite soundtracks of the decade just for a handful of tunes. The game's narrative tone also matches this musical range of tone very well. The first game had characters with some dark backstories, but for the sequel you're dealing with a darker plot, but relationships are fleshed out and developed a lot more and are generally expanded from the first game. There is a genuine sense of character development and progression through both the story and gameplay, not just in this game, but in between games, showing that the developers really gave a shit when they created this world full of interesting characters, and it wasn't just Coomer bait like the franchise has turned into now with games like Reflections and Peach Ball. The gameplay can still be a bit repetitive, but it's the most fun of the whole series here. Now, that doesn't sound like much, but it is immensely fun to combo the fuck out of enemies with the on-the-fly, co-op, tag team switching. Character tag team intros are charming as hell, and some of the story fights are incredibly goddamn hype. Everyone was telling me to try out the original 3DS Senran Kagura game since I covered Estival Versus on the channel years back. And even though Burst Renewal, the remake of the first game, was a bit repetitive, which I also covered, I still enjoyed the story for what it was, even if it was a bit ham-fisted. But Crimson is where the series peaked for me and many others. What a fucking amazing game. Alright. Game number 11. The game we will end this part of the list on before the Big 10. A game that I feel is not only extremely fun and engaging, but was also a little out of my comfort zone.
Tell and roadie. Go tell and roadie. Go tell and roadie that everybody's dead.
Resident Evil 7. As I mentioned with Dead Space 2, I'm not a big fan of horror games, and the first hour or so of Resident Evil 7 was downright terrifying for me to play. But I manned the fuck up and played that shit, and you know what? The game was fucking awesome. Now, going in, I forgot that people were saying the second half of the game isn't very good, and I can kind of agree with that, but it still has some great moments. The main problem with this game, though, and the reason why it isn't in my top 10, actually, is because the ending final fight is so fucking bad, oh my god. There are other reasons, too. The story choice near the end is fucking stupid because it's essentially, do you want the good ending or the bad ending? But you don't know which one you'll get until the end. The game clocks in at a typical Resident Evil length, about 12 or 14 hours, but the other games did that while also having multiple ways to replay the game, adding for more time and arguably better pacing, because once again, the second half in this game isn't great. It's not something I'm knocking it for, it's just not that good. This game makes you replay the opening segments on New Game Plus, which is on rails, and it's not amusing at all on the second time. It's a lot of cutscenes and scripted sequences. The free DLC, Not a Hero, gave a fun way to end everything with a decent final fight, and it ties up some loose ends, but the paid DLC is fucking horrible. End of Zoe is probably some of the worst content I've ever paid and played through in a AAA game. It's absolute fucking garbage. I absolutely hated it. Other than that, Resident Evil 7 is pretty fucking stellar. The game is dripping with atmosphere, the graphics and sound design are top tier, the scares are good and genuine, but they're the kind that don't spook you enough to stop playing once you get hooked in. It's a mix of everything I like. Survival elements with health management and ammo conservation, intricate environments with spiderweb design allowing for finding optional items like weapons, upgrades, and supplies, and also backtracking in meaningful ways. The thriller elements of anticipating enemies and horror through scares of not anticipating enemies. It's an amazing game. You don't even need to play a Resident Evil game to get into it. It's pretty much standalone. It's absolutely incredible. So that pretty much wraps it up. Tune in next time for the top 10 games of the decade. I'll also be doing a few honorable mentions in that list because I had to bump some games off these lists after I already released the honorable mentions video, so there's a couple more games I do want to give some credit to. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time. I'm out.